Welcome to the channel. My name's Daniel, and today we're going to be looking at one of the more surprising indie game titles I've played in recent years. Not only for just how good the game is, but how well it performs as a piece of cyberpunk fiction. Dex was developed and published by Czech video game developer Dreadlocks Limited. The game was originally announced at Game Developers Session 2012 and was greenlit on Steam and also successfully met its modest Kickstarter goal of £14,000 in the same year, eventually raising a total of £30,000. Initially slated for a 2013 release, Dex was instead released as an early access title on Steam in 2014 before finally being released in 2015. Rather than start with the game itself, instead we're going to have a look at the cyberpunk genre as a whole. Simply put, it's a subgenre of science fiction that combines what's referred to as low life with high tech. What's typically meant by that is that high-tech advancements we associate with science fiction, robots, artificial intelligence, genetic and cybernetic modification, and even space exploration, are juxtaposed with a breakdown in social order. If you live in a cyberpunk world, you're living in a world where society hasn't progressed to the same extent that technology has. It's dystopia versus utopia. You're not living in a progressive society like Star Trek, you're living in polluted streets filled with crime and poverty, where megacorporations and governments track your every move, and where personal liberties are traded in for convenience, safety, or sometimes just to stay alive. One of the earlier examples of cyberpunk was the novel Neuromancer by William Gibson, and, even if I feel you should perhaps take some of his views on the genre as it currently stands with a pinch of salt, it's undeniable he had a huge effect on the movement as a whole. As did Philip K. Dick with his novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and Alice Sheldon's novel The Girl Who Was Plugged In, although I would also like to give a few shoutouts to Japanese manga series such as Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira and Masamune Shiro's Ghost in the Shell. Cyberpunk is very much a child of the time of its inception in the 1970s and 1980s. It combined the burgeoning science fiction movement with emerging punk sensibilities to dare to ask the question of if rapid technological advancement would ultimately benefit or harm humanity. To quote Lawrence Person, editor of the Nova Express fanzine, classic cyberpunk characters were marginalised, alienated loners who lived on the edge of society in generally dystopic futures where daily life was impacted by rapid technological change, and ubiquitous datasphere of computerised information and invasive modification of the human body. They weren't Flash Gordon, Doctor Who or Captain Kirk. They weren't confident, beautiful, and cosmopolitan people that acted out of altruism or a heroic sense of duty. They were emotionally numb bounty hunters, rebellious street kids, violent criminals, or even talking heads on a video screen. As Japanese cyberpunk was a whole new kettle of cybernetically enhanced fish. It was still planted firmly in the punk movement, but what we initially got from Japan was a lot more focused around the perversion of the human body and behaviours, and how characters would mutate or become corrupted by sinister industrial forces. Films like Death Powder, Tetsuo the Iron Man, and 964 Pinocchio are all great examples of early Japanese cyberpunk, although I'll warn you that they can be pretty hard to watch. The only one I've seen all the way through was Tetsuo the Iron Man, and that involves maggot-infested wounds, someone's penis turning into an electric drill, and then someone being killed on that drill. So, take from that what you may. So what can we take from this, and how does it relate to video games? So at this point, I'd like to point out the difference between cyberpunk as an aesthetic and cyberpunk as a genre. Cyberpunk as an aesthetic is something that most people who consume science fiction media are going to be familiar with. It's neon, it's chrome, it's rainy streets, and people with weird haircuts and robot arms. It's your understanding of the genre if you watch Blade Runner with the sound turned down, but it doesn't necessarily include the tropes or conventions that, for me at least, really make cyberpunk what it is. After I sat down and really thought about it, I decided that, at least for me, cyberpunk is ultimately about conflict. Not just the conflicts between people, but the conflict of ideas, of concepts and values, and how we reconcile them, or fail to reconcile them, as a society or even as a species. Number 1. Real versus unreal. I initially wanted to call this man versus machine. The more I thought about it, the more I realised that this can actually be better used to cover the ideas presented to us in cyberpunk fiction. It's the idea that experiences, food, events, memories, or even people themselves can be manufactured, often to the point where they're indistinguishable from what we'd consider to be the real thing. Surveillance versus surveillance. A running theme in cyberpunk is how completely invasive and totalitarian surveillance can become. It's the idea that everything you do, purchase, view, or say is being monitored, tracked and logged by inscrutable agencies that either wish to actively do you harm, or are keeping tabs on you, just in case. It's 1984's Big Brother. In some cyberpunk settings, it can even involve the workings of your mind or emotional state of being up for cold clinical analysis. It's the void conf or baseline tests of Blade Runner, or the crime coefficient of Psycho Pass. All systems where your body's unconscious stress responses can quite literally mean the difference between life or death. But what is surveillance? Originally a term coined by Canadian researcher Steve Mann, surveillance quite literally translates to watching from below. It's bringing those cameras I mentioned before down to a human participant level. It's dashboard camera footage or the guy on his phone recording police activity. And it can be both used by people to keep tabs on each other within society or, crucially, to record excesses or abuses of power that might otherwise go undocumented. We also have to consider that the world that many cyberpunk characters live in is a scary one. We already live in a world where the internet allows all kinds of people to connect and to influence each other, to radicalise or to plan, and even lone wolf attacks with easily attainable materials and equipment can be devastating. So when you add the increased opportunities to do harm that the technology of cyberpunk fiction provides, is it possible that the all-encompassing surveillance is necessary to preserve order or human life? What price does freedom have over safety, and is that a choice that we willingly make, or is it one that's made for us?
The governments of the world believe an average citizen should not face the threat of terrorism alone.
We don't need your help. The technology exists today for an individual to protect his property against explosives, firearms, surveillance, intrusion, contamination.
350 million fortresses is not my idea of the land of the free.
It's better than one big fortress constructed by a corrupt government against its people.
3. Man vs. man. As I mentioned before, cyberpunk is not a utopian concept. Although the technology causes and battlefields change, man's inhumanity to man is still as bad as it ever was, or maybe even worse. Life is cheap, and people regularly kill or maim each other over what we view today really as relatively minor issues. It's not just a gang of street punks that's causing havoc, it's corporate kill squads kicking in your door because you infringed on their intellectual copyright. It's cybersecurity networks that don't just keep out hackers but fries their brains while they're doing it. Or it's a judge in Mega City 1 shooting you first and maybe considering to ask questions later. I don't just mean that this covers human conflict, but really the sense that humanity's pretty much turned on itself, that the value of human life is given substantially less worth than it is today. 4. Individualism versus conformity. This is definitely more punk than cyber, but a running theme with a lot of cyberpunk protagonists is, as I mentioned before, that they're outsiders or loners. They're in a world where deviation from the norm is actively discouraged or even outright illegal, or they're people that seek to slip the bonds of the society that they find themselves in, or that just want to express or discover themselves. They're Sam Lowry in Brazil, they're Kay in Blade Runner 2049, or they're even Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2, although whether or not you consider that cyberpunk is entirely down to you. It's the idea that what you want and need as a person, your sense of self and individuality, is something that's at odds with the world around you, and that if you just keep your head down and fall in line, then you'll get along fine. So how does this all relate to Dex? Well, to summarise my feelings on the game, I felt I enjoyed it far more as a genre piece than a game in its own right, although the game itself wasn't bad by any means. If I had to summarise it, I'd call it Deus Ex on a budget, although I think that would be doing the game a disservice. Dex starts off by plunging you straight into the action. Our titular character Dex is woken up by a mysterious transmission from a figure known as Raycast, who informs her that a squad of heavily armed soldiers is on its way to collect her. He helps her block the elevator and she escapes across the rooftops, and Dex soon finds herself on the run with no idea as to why. She punches a police officer to death and then goes to hide in a bar filled with criminal hackers. From there she learns that she's being hunted by a shadowy organisation known as the Complex, who apparently have their hand in everything from major corporations to crooked politicians. And while they're pulling the strings behind the scenes, it's not entirely sure as to why they're interested in Dex in particular. After the tutorial chase, Dex is released into the city of Harbour Prime and is largely left to her own devices to find her own way around. As you explore the various districts, you'll come across different characters, all of which are incredibly trusting, as they're willing to ask a stranger they've just met to do favours for them or to go out and commit outright crimes in exchange for payment. It's standard game logic, but I find it amusing that you can bump into someone on the street and they'll spill their life story before asking you to go out and kill someone. The general gameplay is as follows. It's a 2D side-scrolling action-adventure RPG. Dex is able to run, jump, punch and shoot her way through trouble, and with skill systems she can come to pick locks, persuade people or hack computer systems. It's familiar fare to anyone that's played Deus Ex or anything made in a similar vein, and quests have a satisfyingly high number of different ways to be resolved. It's possible to get through a significant amount of the game without ever actually having to engage in combat. Dex is eventually able to gain cybernetic augmentation, and I actually quite liked the fact that it's impossible to buy and equip all of the different augmentations. They're all useful, although some are more useful than others. I'll talk about that later. So while you have a lot of different methods of tackling problems, you'll eventually find yourself building towards 2 or 3 main strategies in general, at least until the end of the game when money and skill points are easier to come by. As a whole, I actually enjoyed how Dex controlled. I never felt that frustrated by the controls or felt that one particular mechanic was underused or overutilized, although what I will say is that the game does force you to make use of hacking at different points in the main story, so you want to invest in that at least a little if you want to clear the game without a lot of needless aggravation. Combat is made up of Dex's unarmed attacks and gunplay. They both have 2 different skill paths that can be leveled up to make them more effective. Dex can block or roll to evade attacks, and can equip better guns once she has enough skill points that have been invested into the firearms tree. My experience with the combat was that it was fine. Enemies were able to absorb a lot of damage by default, so often I wouldn't even really bother to fight them, especially as I didn't really invest in the combat skills until well into the late game. Guns and ammo are pretty hard to come by early on, so I never even really got around to using them until the very last few missions in the game. There is a takedown that you can use on unaware or disabled enemies, and this is how I dealt with maybe 80% of the hostiles that I ran into. And once you get a certain skill, you can hack enemies' brains to stun them, and after that, it's only a matter of getting behind them and choking them out. This gets really abusable, and especially once you invest into hacking, it can make combat fairly easy, as well as giving you a chance to easily escape from enemies that spot you. The geek in me loves the idea of getting it out of a fight by just hacking someone's brain or eyes to disable them, and as I wasn't really playing the game primarily for its combat, this wasn't really a deal breaker for me. It is also helped by the fact that there are enemies that you can't choke out later on, but that just meant that I ran past them more than fighting them. Hacking is done via a little drone that flies around in augmented or virtual reality and shoots at stuff to hack it. It'll be familiar to anyone that played Nier Automata and was fine. Some hacking sections were a little too long, and I found the sound effect for the basic shot to be a little annoying, which isn't really ideal when you're spamming the fire button like you're in a Japanese shmup. Dex has a focus meter that acts as her health bar in hacking, but this is pretty inconsequential a lot of the time, as she can refill her focus meter for free at several points throughout the world. There are a few secondary attacks that you can upgrade, and while they're not really needed, they do make a few harder sections significantly easier if you deploy them correctly. Exploration in these hacking sections is rewarded with money and focus pickups or additional snippets of lore in the form of emails, and hacking some harder to find nodes in a few sections can open up additional paths or outcomes in certain missions, which I thought was a nice touch. I actually really enjoyed the persuasion system. Whereas most games where persuasion be an automatic success or run off of a dice roll, Dex presents you with 3 different approaches. Picking the correct response makes your persuasion attempt significantly more likely to succeed, and so requires you to get a feel for how the person you are talking to thinks and what their values and wants are. I like this, and how it rewards you for paying attention during conversations, although sometimes you don't have quite enough information to go on, and so it can feel a little bit like a crapshoot as to whether or not you're picking the right option. All in all, I found the game was pretty solidly built. I thought the different mechanics all fit together pretty well, which was actually something of an issue for games made in a similar vein. And while there are a few sticking points, the game as a whole flowed pretty well and had enough polish where it counted. The city of Harbour Prime is pretty well realised, and I enjoyed how the streets had people walking to and fro on them. Urban decay was apparent everywhere and was often offset by slick advertisements or high-tech high-rises just around the corner. Although there were a few elements that do make the city seem a little lifeless, there's no traffic, streets can be a little silent at times, and you quickly come to recognise the same few pedestrian sprites over and over again. Can't really hold this against what was clearly a product made with a lower budget, but I've yet to play any kind of game that really captures the crowded and polluted city streets of Blade Runner. Dex made a good attempt, and I have a lot of respect for development teams that make the best of what they have, but a few extra touches here and there to make the city seem lived in and alive would have really gone a long way. While the different augmentations and skills are all useful in their own way, I would highly recommend that you pick the augmentations and skills that allow you to explore freely first. Protection from electricity and toxic gas and lockpicking skills are all useful and actually required to complete many of the quests in the game. Just on a quick note about the soundtrack of the game's composer was Carol Antonin, I think? Apologies if I mispronounced that. They're a film and game composer with actually quite a surprising number of titles under their belt, and I have to say that while the game soundtrack wasn't incredible, it was incredibly appropriate and really complemented a lot of what was happening at any given moment. If I had to come up with one particular complaint, it's that the sound mixing was a little bit off at some points in the game. I actually had to turn the music volume down really quite low. I think I actually had it at 10 or 15%. And even then, some of the tracks were significantly louder than others and were actually in danger of drowning out character dialogue, while others, after I'd turned the sound down, were almost too quiet to hear.
Yes. So, you like it? Ah, she likes it. Here's the menu.
Cutscenes are made up still images, and while they look nice enough, the fact they're barely animated and reuse a lot of assets is another clue as to how low the game's budget really was. They're serviceable, at least until a few action scenes later on in the story, which don't really work when they're just being presented to you as a slideshow of voice acting. The story was alright. My genre awareness hurt my enjoyment of it a little bit, I think, just by the virtue of how many stories I've looked at in the genre before. There were a few story beats and twists that I was kind of half anticipating before they came up, although to the story's credit, it did manage to throw a few surprises my way before the story was over. Without going into spoilers, I think my main issues with the game were mostly in terms of pacing. The last two missions in the game last just a little bit too long to be welcome, and they can really feel like a slog, something which wasn't helped by some labyrinthine level design, a lack of visual landmarks to navigate by, and some agonisingly long elevator rides that you really can't skip, all in a facility that you have to explore pretty thoroughly to get through. The final choice in the game is complex and nuanced enough to give you something to think about, but the method of making the choice is the same as Deus Ex Human Revolution. You just get to press one of several buttons. It just seems a little bit rushed. So, the reason I talked so much about Cyberpunk as a genre is the reason why Dex left as big an impression on me as it did. It's obvious that the people that made it do have a passion for the genre and what makes it great. The reason I enjoyed Dex was, at least for most of the game, that it presents a setting that focuses on things that you don't normally see in a lot of other Cyberpunk titles, which is that there's a real focus on the human element of the genre. You see a lot of Cyberpunk tropes from street level, how they affect people's lives, and how people react to those circumstances. I'll go into this in a little more detail, but to start off, there's one really good example that I just want to share with you. Dex walks into a kebab shop and is chatted up by the proprietor.
Welcome. Ah, this is blue. Your hair. A symbol of nobility and of pride. A commendable choice, miss. A prodigious choice. It adds spice to your youthful beauty. With a heavy dash of leave me alone.
He cooks kofta via traditional methods which require cumin seeds for flavour and aroma, but he isn't allowed to buy the seeds due to a corporate patent on the plants. It turns out that a major conglomerate owns the rights to cumin seeds and so will only sell him processed and packaged cumin powder instead. The reason I like this quest so much is how dense it is thematically. He laments how traditional values are dying out in the face of punishing intellectual property law, and how something as fundamental as buying seeds is mercilessly being restricted.
How can you patent fruits, vegetables, spices? Yes, even spices. They say I cannot grow cumin. That cumin is patented. I must buy it from them. And then I go to their stores and they don't sell the seeds, just the cumin powder. Something about health and hygiene, they tell me. But how can you make real kofte with powders and packets? All the flavor gone. No appreciation of old Adana cooking.
He's doing his best to maintain something that's meaningful and personal for him in the middle of a vast and uncaring dystopia, and it's clear that making food to be enjoyed is something that means a lot to him. What's really notable here is that this isn't a major character. It's someone you meet and maybe speak to once or twice that gives you a side quest to pick up some seeds, but you get so much from just a brief encounter, and for me, that's a hallmark of really good video game writing. Honestly, I really can't think of many characters that weren't memorable in some way or another. Even characters that you briefly interact with as part of a quest have some degree of personality and characterization to them for lines of dialogue that in other games would just be palmed off on a generic NPC.
Ma'am, madam, milady, what'll be your taste? Guns, C-band, intel, uppers, downers, flip your head arounders? Me, am your man. With all due respect, ma'am, from my experience, there ain't no young on the street. There's survive and there's or don't. Now how might I be of service to you?
The voice acting is universally excellent. Even on major titles, you'll typically find one or two performances that aren't that impressive, but honestly I think that the voice acting was of an exceptionally high quality for a project of this scope. Each and every character is a voice actor that really puts a lot of effort and care into their performance, and that's a testament to both good voice acting and good voice acting direction.
And if dying's your thing, I mean going... Stupid, okay. I can show you a way out of here. There's a tunnel ahead of you. We'll take you straight out of the sewers. Problem is... I know, I'm getting to it. The gate is locked. Locked it is. Yes, Lady Lou.
I have a lot of respect for voice actors in general, but the quality of direction can really make all the difference in how good the final product is. So let's go back to look at those conflicts I mentioned earlier, and let's see how Dex approaches them. 1. Real versus unreal. Augmented and virtual reality are one of Dex's main methods of interacting with the world, and many of the most crucial moments of the story take place entirely in virtual reality. What you do is a little zappy drone thing have real tangible effects on the so-called real world. Even in what might look like a safe and welcoming environment can be swarming with viruses and security programs that can and will do real harm to Dex if they overcome her. Dex lives between two worlds, but she's significantly more powerful in the virtual realm than she is in the physical one. The Complex, a sinister and shadowy organisation, freely manipulate and fabricate events to further their agenda, and there are some more explicit examples later in the story, which I won't spoil, which directly call into question artificiality and how it affects us as human beings. There's also an interesting dialogue within the game about the ethics of cybernetic enhancement.
Unnatural. Are vehicles natural? Or should we still ride horses? Is electricity natural? Or should we stick with campfires? And clothes? Should we be running around shivering and showing off our bits? You're fine with a neckplate to look the part. Is that really so different to something integrated, functional, and permanent? I mean, how will an augmentation make you any less human if humanity is about progress, and progress is about technology? Technology founded civilization, not the other way around. This here is the next step in the evolution of our species, the natural next step. Or are you worried about being less you? You don't need a philosopher to tell you that you're more than a physical body. Soul, consciousness, destiny, call it what you will. But why would that essence be any worse off if you made your body better? You give it power. Jump higher, run faster, deduce quicker, and kick ass harder.
Are you less human because you've traded in parts of yourself for machinery? If you're better than human, are you still human? Does it even matter? Technically, anyone that wears glasses is using technology to enhance their natural abilities in some way, so where do we draw the line? 2. Surveillance versus surveillance. This is where Dex isn't quite as explicit, although there are a few things I'd like to mention. Dex isn't always looking over her shoulder, and it's clear she's being hunted pretty much all the time, especially in a society where even people's eyes can record footage or video and stream them elsewhere. Not to mention, a lot of quests involve you regularly invading people's privacy, either by reading their emails, rooting around in their homes, or aggressively questioning them about their life problems. No one has any secrets in Harbor Prime. And whether it's reading about someone subscribing to a pornographic website, or about how they're being blackmailed into covering up an industrial accident, it's all the same. What's notable is that surveillance isn't even just a tool of the Complex. The goal of the hackers opposing them is perfect surveillance, a level playing field where everything is exposed and thus removing the Complex's power.
Then we were this close to an anarchist's Eden, an AI seeing everything, loyal to nothing. It wouldn't have been programmers dealing with Kether, it would have been politicians. How do you blackmail an AI if you don't have nobody doing the desiring, no family to be protecting? How do you bribe? We were this close to shaking up the entire system from the top down. Anything would have been possible. But the Complex, they had an ace up their sleeve.
3. Man versus man. This one's pretty straightforward. It's not possible to do a pacifist run in Dex, at least as far as I can see. Dex can and does kill people in her journey, and there were times when I felt that the poor guys that I was beating up or strangling to death were just security guards that came to work on the wrong day. It's a setting where people are harvested for organs which are sold on the black market, where people are murdered by gangsters of impunity, conditioned into being sex slaves to be sold, or where popular celebrities are treated as commodities by their agencies, where they don't even own their own voices. It's all pretty grim, but never to a ridiculous level as some other Cyberpunk universes go to, which I appreciate as it helped keep things grounded for me. You know, ignoring the fact that Dex can punch people to death from the start of the game. Individualism versus conformity. Like with other Cyberpunk protagonists, Dex is a notable outsider. She's not a criminal, a spy, or a cop, she's a regular person, save her unusual hacking ability. And at least to start with, she carries herself more like a plucky underdog than a hyper-competent hacker commando.
13,807,001. Something out of nothing. Something's raining down. A river of what to do's, who to be's. Stand out, blend in, help him, go to war and win.
I like her visual design. Her blue hair is a nice splash of colour that means you can instantly spot her in a crowd, while also giving her a distinctive look. And while she's very much a fish out of water, she approaches a lot of conversations with a wry sense of humour, although I would have liked if they'd been able to record her in-game dialogue, especially given that she's voiced in the cutscenes. During the game, Dex will also meet many people who have suffered due to their idealism in the face of a vast and uncaring world, such as the kebab shop owner I mentioned before, a boy whose terminally ill mother he could save if he just betrays his own moral and religious code, or a police officer trying to deal out justice the old-fashioned way in a world filled with combat cyborgs and high-tech weaponry. I really appreciate how well realised the characters are, which isn't something you see as often as you should. Virtually all the characters you meet have their own wants, needs and motivations, and I think that all the time and effort spent here really paid off when it came to world building and player investment. And that's Dex. It's not the best game out there, but it is an interesting one, and I feel that, especially if you're a fan of the Cyberpunk genre, it's worth your time to check out. At the time of writing, the game is currently selling for $20 on Steam or $15 on GOG.com. When I checked to see what Dreadlocks Limited is working on at the moment, I saw that they'd announced a first-person horror game called Ghost Theory with many of Dex's development team working on it, although notably, I noticed a change of game designers. Ghost Theory is currently slated for a 2018 release, although when I looked into it, I noticed a worrying lack of updates on the product, along with more than a few comments from jilted crowdfunders who were becoming increasingly nervous or angry over what seems like an abandoned project. While I wouldn't want that to detract from whether or not you get Dex, I feel that ethically it would at least be worth mentioning that while Dreadlocks has successfully used crowdfunding in the past to release quality product, that may not be consistent behaviour. Time will tell in that regard. Hey there everyone, thanks for making it all the way through the video. This is my first time ever really making anything like this. I've just come off of editing the whole thing and I have to say it was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. If you have any feedback or constructive criticism, please feel free to leave a comment below. If you thought it was interesting in some way, or even if you just hated it, please do let me know. At this point, any feedback at all would be massively appreciated. And yeah, if you like it, share it, get some views on it. If not, that's fine as well. I really don't know what to say here, so yeah, thanks a lot. See you.
I'm not gonna stand here and listen to you badmouth the greatest democracy the world has ever known.